The barbershop was supposed to close in 2 weeks, but when Shaq walked in and found Reggie's hands shaking over a pair of clippers, he knew it wasn't just about rent. Marcus had sabotaged the supplies, bribed the landlord, and starved the business, all to take what wasn't his. Shaq's jaw tightened as he stared at the faded "for sale" sign. "This isn't over," he muttered, pulling out his phone. By the next morning, the building was his. Marcus thought he'd won. Shaq was about to show him what losing really looked like. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Shaq stepped out of his car, adjusting his sunglasses as he took in the familiar streets of his old neighborhood. It had been years, but something about this place always pulled him back. Then, he saw it. A small, run-down barbershop sat on the corner. Its once bright red and white pole now sun-bleached and dull. The window was covered in dust, and slapped against the glass was a crooked, faded "for sale" sign. Shaq's stomach tightened. Something about this didn't sit right. Barbershops like this weren't just businesses. They were anchors in the community. He had spent hours in places like this as a kid, getting fresh cuts, listening to old heads debate sports and life. These places never closed, so why was this one dying? His curiosity turned into something heavier. A gut feeling. Shaq pushed open the door, and a weak bell jingled. Inside, the shop was eerily quiet. The walls, once decorated with posters of classic fades and razor-sharp lineups, were peeling. A stack of old magazines sat untouched. The only sound was the soft hum of clippers, buzzing like a tired heartbeat. At the far end, an older barber stood over a customer, trimming the last edges of a fade. His shoulders were hunched, his grip slow but steady. Shaq recognized him instantly. Reggie. Back in the day, Reggie had been the best in the game. People waited hours just to sit in his chair. His hands had been fast, precise, full of energy. Now, his hands looked tired. Shaq watched as Reggie finished the cut, dusted off the customer's shoulders, and barely reacted when the man handed him a few crumpled bills. There was no small talk, no laughter, just a soft sigh as the door closed behind the man. The shop was empty. Shaq shifted uncomfortably in his seat. It felt like a funeral. Reggie finally turned toward him, his expression unreadable. "You need a cut?" His voice was rough, quieter than Shaq remembered. Shaq stood, walking over. As he sat in the chair, he caught their reflections in the mirror. Reggie's eyes narrowed slightly. "Shaquille Johnson?" Shaq smirked. "Took you long enough." Reggie let out a dry chuckle. "Man, it's been years." Shaq nodded, his eyes scanning the room. "Yeah, looks like a lot's changed." Reggie exhaled through his nose, picking up his clippers. His hand hovered over the switch. Then he sighed, setting them down. "You're probably my last customer." Shaq leaned back in the old leather chair, feeling its familiar creak beneath him. This chair had history. Thousands of cuts, countless conversations, and decades of memories lived in its worn-out frame. But now, it felt like a funeral seat. Behind him, Reggie stood still, clippers in hand. But something was off. His hands were shaking. Shaq frowned. "You good, old man?" Reggie exhaled, flicking the clippers on. The familiar buzz filled the empty shop, but it didn't drown out the weight in the air. "Shop's closing." The words came out flat, emotionless. Shaq's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean, closing?" Reggie moved the clippers along Shaq's hairline, avoiding his gaze. 2 weeks, that's all I got left." Shaq's grip tightened on the armrests. "What happened?" Reggie chuckled dryly. "Same thing that always happens. Rent went up, business dried up. You don't pay, you don't stay." Shaq clenched his jaw. He had seen this before. Gentrification creeping in, pushing out the people who built the neighborhood. Small businesses crushed under rising costs while big investors circled like vultures. He turned his head slightly. "And you're just letting it go?" Reggie's hands paused midair, just for a second. Then he continued, slower this time. "Ain't about letting go." His voice was quieter now, heavier. "It's about knowing when you lost." Shaq shook his head. "Nah, that's not you, Reggie. You used to be a fighter." "What changed?" Reggie clicked off the clippers and set them down. He leaned against the counter, rubbing his temples. "You ever been in a fight where you already knew you lost before you threw a punch?" Shaq stayed silent. Reggie sighed. "That's where I'm at, kid." Shaq folded his arms. "Who's behind this?" Reggie hesitated, then finally met Shaq's gaze in the mirror. A name left his lips, quiet but full of betrayal. Marcus. Reggie's voice was tight, his jaw clenched as he muttered the name like it left a bitter taste in his mouth. Marcus. Shaq leaned forward, gripping the armrests of the barber chair. He had expected the name of some greedy landlord or corporate real estate shark, someone who had no ties to this place, no real understanding of its history. But not Marcus. Not the kid who used to sweep these very floors. "The same Marcus I'm thinking about?" Shaq asked, narrowing his eyes. "The one who used to hang around here, always watching, always asking questions about how to perfect a lineup." Reggie let out a dry chuckle, but there was no humor in it. "Same one," he muttered. "Back then he had nothing. Just a kid with a busted-up pair of clippers and a dream. I took him in, taught him everything I knew, treated him like my own." Shaq could hear the weight in Reggie's voice. This wasn't just business. This was personal. "So, what happened?" Shaq asked, his voice low. Reggie sighed, running a hand over his graying beard. He turned and leaned against the counter, his eyes locked on a dusty old photo on the wall. Shaq followed his gaze. It was an old picture. Reggie, younger and stronger, standing next to a teenage Marcus. Marcus had a grin on his face, holding up a fresh set of clippers like they were a trophy. "That kid had talent," Reggie murmured. "He was good, real good. Could have been the best. I taught him, mentored him, and when he got good enough, I even gave him my blessing to start his own shop. Told him I was proud of him." Shaq studied the photo. He had seen this story before. A student rising up, a mentor getting left behind. "But Marcus didn't just start his own shop, did he?" Shaq asked. Reggie's jaw tightened. "Number he came back to take mine." Shaq felt his blood pressure rise. "How?" Reggie exhaled sharply, pushing off the counter. "Marcus got connected, started pulling in investors, playing the game differently. While I was still cutting hair and paying rent, he was buying buildings. The same streets that made him. He started buying them up piece by piece." Shaq narrowed his eyes. "And now he's trying to take yours?" Reggie nodded, rubbing his temple. "Already has." Shaq sat forward. "What do you mean?" Reggie's voice was bitter. "You think I put that for sale sign up? That wasn't my call. Marcus got to my landlord, convinced him it was time for new blood to take over. They're selling the lease out from under me. I didn't even get a chance to fight." Shaq's hands clenched into fists. This wasn't just business. This was straight-up betrayal. "You can't tell me that's legal," Shaq muttered. Reggie chuckled. "Legal don't mean right. The lease is up in 2 weeks. Landlord never even offered me a renewal. And with the way business has been," he shrugged, "even if I fought, I ain't got the money to match his offer." Shaq felt anger boiling under his skin. Marcus wasn't just looking to take over. He was erasing the man who built him. Shaq shook his head. "That's cold." Reggie looked down at his hands. "Yeah, but that's the game now." Shaq stood up, rolling his shoulders. "This ain't over." Reggie sighed, rubbing his eyes. "Yeah, it is." Shaq stepped out of the barbershop, the door's weak jingle barely audible over the weight in his chest. This wasn't just a shop closing down. This was a robbery in broad daylight. Marcus wasn't just taking over. He was wiping Reggie out. Shaq clenched his jaw, rolling his shoulders as he walked down the block. He hadn't planned on staying in town long, but after hearing Reggie's story, that had changed. He wasn't here for a cut anymore. He was on a mission. Shaq knew one thing. The streets always talked. If Marcus was playing dirty, someone out here knew about it. He started with the old heads, guys who had been in the neighborhood for years. He found Mr. Glover, the owner of a small corner store down the street, a man who had seen businesses rise and fall from behind his cash register. Shaq leaned against the counter, nodding toward the barbershop. "You hear about what's going on with Reggie?" Mr. Glover sighed, shaking his head. "Damn shame. That shop's been there longer than most of these buildings." Shaq folded his arms. "You think Marcus really did him like that?" Mr. Glover gave Shaq a knowing look. "You don't get that big that fast without stepping on folks." Shaq's stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" Glover rubbed his chin. "A few months back, Reggie started struggling to get supplies. Blades, aftershave, even cleaning products. Every time he ordered, shipments got delayed. Prices went up. Word is Marcus started paying off suppliers to make sure Reggie couldn't keep up." Shaq felt heat rise in his chest. "You're saying Marcus is blocking him from even getting inventory?" Glover nodded. Reggie don't even know. He just thinks business is slow. But Marcus? He made sure of it. Shaq exhaled sharply. This was worse than he thought. Marcus wasn't just competing, he was sabotaging. And Reggie had no idea. Shaq spent the rest of the afternoon talking to other business owners, piecing together the puzzle. Everywhere he turned, the story was the same. Marcus had built his empire through backdoor deals and intimidation. If a barbershop stood in his way, he didn't outwork them, he crushed them. Shaq's hands tightened into fists. Marcus wasn't some businessman making smart moves. He was a snake, and Shaq had just stepped into his territory. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Shaq made his way back to the barbershop. Reggie was still inside, sweeping the floor. Shaq stepped in, shutting the door behind him. Reggie looked up. "You back already?" Shaq nodded, his expression serious. "Yeah, and I found out something you need to hear." Reggie leaned on his broom, raising an eyebrow. "That's so?" Shaq didn't sugarcoat it. "Marcus has been blocking your supplies, bribing vendors, making sure you can't keep up." Reggie's face darkened. He stood still for a moment, then let out a low chuckle. "Man," he muttered, shaking his head. "Didn't even see it coming." Shaq watched the pain settle in his old friend's eyes. "You've been played worse than you think," Shaq said. Reggie sighed, setting down his broom. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I'm starting to see that." Reggie finally realizes the full extent of Marcus's betrayal, but is he too broken to fight back? Shaq's footsteps were heavy as he pushed open the glass door of the executive cut. A wave of expensive cologne and fresh aftershave hit him immediately. Inside, the shop gleamed under bright LED lights, the walls lined with gold-framed mirrors reflecting perfection. Each barber station was spotless, the chairs upholstered in sleek black leather, and every single customer wore the same smug, satisfied expression. It was the kind of place that screamed money and exclusivity. But to Shaq, it reeked of betrayal. At the far end of the shop, Marcus stood leaning against the counter, mid-conversation with a client. His signature smirk was in place, his tailored gray suit perfectly fitted, like a man who had already won. Shaq didn't hesitate. He walked straight up to him, the weight of his presence shifting the energy in the room. "We need to talk." The shop fell silent. Barbers paused mid-cut. Customers glanced up from their phones. Even the receptionist, who had been typing away at the computer, let her fingers hover over the keyboard, sensing the sudden tension. Marcus, though? He didn't even flinch. Instead, he turned slowly, looking Shaq up and down like he was some old relic of the past. Then, with a slow shake of his head, he chuckled. "Well, look who it is. Big Shaq. Ain't seen you around in a minute." Shaq didn't return the smile. "Yeah, been busy," he said, folding his arms across his chest. "But I hear you've been busier." Marcus smirked, tilting his head slightly. "Man, you always had a way of making things sound personal." Shaq didn't blink. "Ain't it?" Marcus sighed like this whole thing was beneath him. "Come on, man, this is business. Reggie's time was up and I stepped in. That's how the world works." Shaq's jaw tightened. "You call starving him out business?" His voice was controlled, but there was fire behind it. "Blocking his suppliers? Making sure he couldn't even keep the lights on?" Marcus shrugged, completely unfazed. "I did what I had to do. You think I made it this far playing fair?" Shaq exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders back as he fought to control the anger simmering just below the surface. "You got no loyalty," he muttered, shaking his head. Marcus's smirk wavered for the briefest second. "Loyalty don't pay bills. Ownership does." Shaq held his gaze, letting the words settle. Then finally he smiled. A slow, knowing smile. Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly. "What?" Shaq stepped forward, lowering his voice just enough that only Marcus could hear. "Okay," he said, his voice low, steady, dangerous. "Let's play." Marcus thinks he's won, but Shaq just made his first move. Shaq didn't waste time. He walked into Linden Property Management with a purpose, his broad shoulders squared, his jaw clenched. He had left Marcus's shop with fire in his veins, and now he was here to find out exactly how deep this corruption ran. The receptionist, a thin woman with glasses perched on her nose, barely looked up from her screen. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked, typing away. Shaq exhaled, already annoyed. "I need to see Gerald Linden, now." The name made her pause. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard before she glanced up, looking Shaq over. His height, his presence, The sheer weight of his reputation. She knew better than to brush him off. "Mr. Linden doesn't usually take walk-ins," she said carefully. Shaq pulled out his phone and tapped the screen twice, holding it up for her to see. A business headline glowed back at her. NBA star Shaquille Johnson expands real estate portfolio. $100 million investments underway. Her face changed instantly. Let me see if he's available," she stammered before disappearing down a hallway. Shaq leaned against the counter, his pulse steady but his mind racing. Something about this deal didn't sit right. Reggie's lease wasn't just expiring. Someone had stolen it right from under him. Less than a minute later, the receptionist returned, still flustered. "Mr. Linden will see you now." Shaq nodded once and stepped through the frosted glass doors into the lion's den. Gerald Linden sat behind a massive oak desk, his fingers laced together, his belly stretching against his vest. He was in his late 50s, balding, with cold, calculating eyes that had probably seen more dirty deals than most crooks on the street. Shaq didn't bother sitting. "You sold Reggie's lease to Marcus." His voice was calm, but the steel underneath it was unmistakable. Linden smirked, leaning back in his chair like he had expected this conversation. "That shop was on borrowed time," he said smoothly. "Rent was increasing. Business was slow. I did what was best for the property." Shaq's jaw tightened. "You never even offered Reggie a renewal, did you?" Linden swirled the whiskey in his glass. "Didn't have to." That's when Shaq knew. This wasn't just a case of raising the rent. This had been planned from the start. Linden saw the realization in Shaq's eyes and smirked wider. "What, you think I was going to let an old man with a dying business keep prime real estate? Marcus made me a better offer months ago." Shaq felt something dark settle in his chest. Reggie never even had a chance. His shop had been stolen before he even knew it was on the market. Linden chuckled, taking a sip of his drink. "It's nothing personal. It's just—" Shaq stepped forward suddenly, planting both hands on the desk. Linden flinched. Shaq's voice dropped. "You think you're slick?" Linden recovered quickly, smirking again. "I think I'm a businessman." Shaq pulled out his phone, already dialing a number. The call rang once before a voice answered. "Yeah?" Shaq's eyes never left Linden's. "I want every paper this guy ever signed." Linden's smirk disappeared. For the first time, he looked nervous. Shaq is about to expose the entire setup. Linden and Marcus have no idea what's coming. The landlord leaned back in his leather chair, a smug grin spreading across his face. "Your little stunt won't stop this deal," he said, tapping his fingers on the desk like he'd already won. Shaq stood across from him, calm and unshaken, a faint smile playing on his lips. "That wasn't the stunt," he replied, his voice steady. The room seemed to hold its breath. Shaq had spent the last 48 hours buried in paperwork, legal jargon, and phone calls. He'd found it, a loophole in the contract. The sale wasn't final. Not yet. The landlord had rushed the process, cutting corners to push Reggie out, and Shaq had caught it. He slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. "You missed something," he said, his tone casual, like he was pointing out a typo. The landlord's grin faltered as he scanned the document. His face went pale. Meanwhile, Marcus was pacing his sleek modern barbershop, his phone pressed to his ear. His investors were getting nervous. Word had spread about Shaq's involvement, and now they were questioning Marcus's ability to close the deal. "I told you it's handled," Marcus snapped, his voice rising. But the voice on the other end wasn't convinced. "If this falls through, we're pulling out," the investor said coldly. Marcus hung up, his jaw clenched. He grabbed his keys and stormed out the door. Back at Reggie's shop, the air was thick with tension. Reggie sat in his barber chair, staring at the faded walls like he was saying goodbye. Shaq walked in, holding a folder stuffed with papers. "We've got a shot," he said, his voice cutting through the silence. Reggie looked up, his eyes tired but curious. "What kind of shot?" he asked. Shaq opened the folder, revealing the loophole. "The sale isn't final, we can still fight this." Before Reggie could respond, the door slammed open. Marcus stood there, his chest heaving, his eyes blazing. "What the hell are you doing?" he barked, pointing a finger at Shaq. Shaq didn't flinch. He turned to face Marcus, his expression calm but sharp. "Helping a friend," he said simply. Marcus stepped closer, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you can just waltz in here and mess everything up?" Shaq tilted his head, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. I didn't mess anything up. You did. Marcus's face twisted in confusion and anger. What are you talking about? Shaq held up the folder. Your little deal with the landlord? It's not as solid as you thought. The sale isn't final. And now your investors know it. Marcus's eyes widened. He glanced at Reggie, then back at Shaq. You're bluffing, he said, but there was a crack in his confidence. Shaq shrugged. Call your investors. Ask them how they feel about the risk now. Marcus hesitated, his fists clenching and unclenching. He took a step back, his mind racing. This isn't over, he groaned, his voice trembling with rage. Shaq leaned against the counter, his smile widening. You sure? He asked, his tone light, almost playful. Marcus glared at him for a long moment, then turned on his heel and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed through the shop, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Reggie let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. You really think this'll work? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Shaq looked at him, his expression serious now. It's not over yet, he said. But we've got a chance, and that's more than you had yesterday. Outside, Marcus was on the phone, his voice frantic. We need to move faster, he said to the landlord. If this falls apart, I'm ruined. The landlord's voice was cold. I'm already working on it, but your boy Shaq is a problem. Marcus clenched his teeth. I'll handle Shaq, he said, his voice dark. Just make sure the deal goes through. Back in the shop, Shaq was already on his next move. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number. It's me, he said when the call connected. We need to speed things up. Marcus is getting desperate. He listened for a moment, then nodded. Good. Let's make sure he doesn't see this coming. Reggie watched him, a mix of hope and fear in his eyes. What are you planning? He asked. Shaq looked at him, a glint of determination in his gaze. Something Marcus won't expect, he said. But you're gonna have to trust me. The shop fell silent again, the weight of what was coming hanging in the air. Shaq's plan was in motion, but trouble was brewing, and Marcus wasn't the type to go down without a fight. Marcus's voice echoed in Shaq's mind as he stared at the door. This isn't over. Shaq smirked. You sure? He muttered to himself. But deep down, he knew the real battle was just beginning. Marcus strode into the landlord's office, his confidence radiating like a man who'd already won. The landlord sat behind his desk, a stack of papers neatly arranged in front of him. We're closing this today, Marcus said, his voice smooth, his smile wide. The landlord nodded, reaching for a pen. Finally, he muttered, relief evident in his tone. But just as the pen touched the paper, the door creaked open. Shaq stepped inside, a folder tucked under his arm and a calm, almost amused expression on his face. Marcus froze, his smile slipping. The landlord looked up, his brow furrowing. What's this? He demanded, his voice sharp. Shaq didn't answer immediately. He walked to the desk, placed the folder down, and opened it with deliberate slowness. I think you'll want to see this, he said, his tone casual but firm. Marcus's eyes darted to the folder, then back to Shaq. What are you doing here? He snapped, his voice rising. Shaq ignored him, pulling out a single sheet of paper and sliding it toward the landlord. The man's eyes scanned the document, his face growing paler with each word. This can't be right, he stammered, his hands trembling. Shaq leaned against the desk, his arms crossed. It's very right, he said. I bought the building. Yesterday. Your deal with Marcus? It's void. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Marcus's face went slack, his confidence shattering. What? He choked out, his voice barely audible. The landlord shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. You can't do this, he shouted, his face red with anger. Shaq didn't flinch. Already did, he replied, his voice calm but edged with steel. He turned to Marcus, who was still staring at him in disbelief. You thought you had this locked up, didn't you? Shaq said, a faint smile playing on his lips. But you forgot one thing. Marcus's hands clenched into fists. What's that? He growled, his voice low and dangerous. Shaq stepped closer, his gaze steady. You underestimated me. The room fell silent, the weight of Shaq's words sinking in. Marcus's mind raced, trying to piece together how this had happened. He'd been so close to finally burying Reggie and taking everything for himself. And now, in one move, Shaq had turned the tables. The landlord slumped back into his chair, his face ashen. "This is a disaster," he muttered, running a hand through his thinning hair. Shaq turned to him, his expression softening slightly. "You brought this on yourself," he said. "You could have done right by Reggie. Instead, you chose greed." The landlord didn't respond, his eyes fixed on the floor. Marcus, however, wasn't ready to give up. He stepped forward, his voice shaking with barely contained rage. "You think this is over?" he spat, his eyes blazing. "You think you can just waltz in here and take everything?" Shaq met his gaze, unflinching. "I didn't take anything," he said. "I just leveled the playing field." Marcus laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "You're out of your depth, Shaq. This isn't your world." Shaq's smile didn't waver. "Maybe not," he said, "but I'm learning fast." He reached into the folder and pulled out another document, handing it to Marcus. "Here's a copy for you. Thought you might want to see it in writing." Marcus snatched the paper, his eyes scanning the text. His hands trembled as he read the details. Shaq's name on the deed, the date of purchase, the legal jargon that made it all official. He looked up, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. You can't do this," he stammered, his voice breaking. Shaq tilted his head, his smile widening. "Already did," he said, his tone light but final. Marcus stared at him, his mind racing for a way out, a way to fight back. But for the first time he felt it, the cold, sinking realization that he'd lost. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the parking lot. Shaq walked out of the building, the folder still under his arm. He took a deep breath, the cool evening air filling his lungs. It wasn't over. Not yet. Marcus wasn't the type to go down without a fight, and Shaq knew he'd have to stay one step ahead. But for now, he allowed himself a small moment of satisfaction. He'd done what he set out to do. Reggie's shop was safe. The community had a chance to rebuild. And Marcus? He was finally seeing what it felt like to lose. As Shaq reached his car, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, a text from Reggie. "You coming back?" it read. Shaq smiled and typed a quick reply. "On my way." He slid into the driver's seat, the weight of the day settling on his shoulders. But it was a good weight, the kind that came with knowing you'd done the right thing. Back in the office, Marcus was still standing there, the document crumpled in his hand. The landlord was on the phone, his voice frantic. "We need to fix this," he was saying. "There has to be a way." Marcus didn't respond. He was too busy replaying the last few minutes in his head, trying to figure out where it had all gone wrong. Finally, he turned and walked out, his steps heavy, his mind racing. He wasn't done. Not yet. Shaq might have won this round, but Marcus wasn't going to let it end here. He'd find a way to fight back. He always did. Marcus stopped at the door, his hand on the knob. He looked back at the landlord, his eyes dark with determination. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low and dangerous. The landlord nodded, but there was fear in his eyes. Marcus stepped out into the night, his mind already plotting his next move. Shaq might have won the battle, but the war was far from over. Reggie turned the key in the lock, the click echoing in the quiet street. He stared at the faded sign above the door, Reggie's barbershop, and let out a long, heavy sigh. This was it, the end of an era. He patted the door gently, like he was saying goodbye to an old friend. "Guess this is it," he muttered to himself, his voice thick with emotion. But as he turned to leave, the sound of a truck rumbling down the street made him pause. A work van pulled up, its brakes squeaking as it came to a stop. Two men hopped out carrying a large wrapped sign. Reggie frowned, stepping closer. "What's going on here?" he called out, his voice tinged with confusion. One of the workers glanced at him. "New sign," he said simply, already climbing a ladder to remove the old one. Reggie's heart skipped a beat. New sign? For who? Before the worker could answer, a familiar voice cut through the air. "For you." Reggie spun around to see Shaq walking toward him, a set of keys dangling from his fingers and a grin on his face. Reggie blinked, his mind struggling to catch up. "Shaq? What's all this?" he asked, his voice trembling. Shaq stopped in front of him, holding out the keys. "No more rent, no more stress, it's yours," he said, his tone calm but filled with quiet pride. Reggie stared at the keys, then back at Shaq, his brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Shaq's grin widened. "I bought the building," he said, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. "It's yours now, free and clear." Reggie's mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked at the workers who were already unwrapping the new sign. The sunlight caught the fresh paint, revealing the same name, Reggie's Barbershop, but now bold and bright, like it had been given a second chance. I don't understand," Reggie stammered, his voice breaking. Shaq stepped closer, his expression softening. "You don't have to," he said. "Just know it's yours. No one can take it from you. Not Marcus, not the landlord. No one." Reggie's hands shook as he reached for the keys. He turned them over in his palm, the metal cool against his skin. For the first time in years, he felt something he'd almost forgotten, hope, but it was more than that. It was gratitude, relief, and a deep, overwhelming sense of belonging. He looked up at Shaq, his eyes glistening. "Why?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Why would you do this?" Shaq shrugged, his smile easy but sincere. "Because you deserved better," he said. "And because this place, it's not just a barbershop, it's home. For you, for the community, for me." Reggie swallowed hard, his throat tight. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his chest. Instead, he reached out and pulled Shaq into a tight embrace, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Shaq patted his back, his own eyes misty. "It's okay, Reggie," he said softly. "You're gonna be okay." The workers stepped back, admiring the new sign as it gleamed in the sunlight. The street, once quiet and empty, seemed to come alive with the hum of possibility. But as Reggie pulled away, wiping his eyes, a shadow moved at the end of the street. Marcus stood there, his face unreadable, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. He watched for a moment, then turned and walked away, his steps slow and deliberate. Shaq noticed him, but said nothing. He knew this wasn't over. Not yet. Reggie fell silent, looking at Shaq with tears in his eyes. "I don't know how to thank you," he whispered. Shaq shook his head. "You don't have to." But as Reggie turned to admire the new sign, Shaq's gaze drifted back to where Marcus had been standing. The game wasn't over, and Shaq knew the next move would be the hardest. Reggie wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, his vision blurry from the tears he couldn't hold back. "I don't even know what to say," he murmured, his voice trembling. The barbershop buzzed around him, alive in a way it hadn't been in years. The chairs were full, the sound of clippers and laughter filled the air, and the scent of aftershave and hair products mingled into something that felt like home. Reggie looked around, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and disbelief. This was his shop, his legacy, and it was thriving. Shaq leaned against the counter, watching the scene with a quiet smile. He'd done this. He'd brought life back to this place, not just for Reggie, but for the entire community. Kids sat in the chairs, their parents chatting nearby, and old-timers swapped stories like they'd never left. It was more than a barbershop. It was a gathering place, a sanctuary, and it was alive again. Reggie turned to Shaq, his eyes still glistening. "You did this," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You brought it all back." Shaq shook his head, his smile humble. "Nah, Reggie, you did this. I just gave it a little push." Reggie chuckled, wiping his eyes again. "A little push? You bought the whole building, Shaq. That's more than a push." Shaq shrugged, his grin widening. "Call it whatever you want, but this?" He gestured to the packed shop. "This is all you." Reggie looked around again, his chest tightening with gratitude. He'd spent so many years feeling like he'd failed, like he'd let everyone down. But now he felt like he'd been given a second chance, and he wasn't going to waste it. Shaq pushed off the counter and walked over to one of the empty chairs. "All right, Reggie," he said, sitting down and draping the cape over himself. "Let's see if you still got it." Reggie raised an eyebrow, a smirk tugging at his lips. "You sure you're ready for this?" he asked, picking up his clippers. Shaq leaned back in the chair, his expression playful. "I've been ready, just don't mess it up." The room erupted in laughter, the sound warm and familiar. Reggie shook his head, his smile wide as he stepped behind the chair. He ran his fingers through Shaq's hair, assessing the cut. "You're in good hands," he said. his voice steady now, filled with the confidence of a man who'd been doing this his whole life. He flicked on the clippers, the buzz filling the air as he got to work. The shop fell into a comfortable rhythm, the chatter and laughter blending with the sound of the clippers. Reggie worked with precision, his hands steady and sure. It felt like old times, like the shop had never been on the brink of closing, like Marcus and the landlord and all the stress had never happened. For the first time in years, Reggie felt at peace. When he was done, Reggie spun the chair around and handed Shaq a mirror. "Well?" he asked, his tone teasing but his eyes soft. Shaq studied his reflection, running a hand over his fresh cut. "Not bad," he said, his grin returning. "Not bad at all." Reggie crossed his arms, his smirk turning into a full-blown smile. "Not bad? That's the best cut you've ever had, and you know it." Shaq laughed, standing up and brushing a few stray hairs off his shoulders. All right. You win," he said, holding up his hands in mock surrender. Reggie's smile softened, his eyes locking with Shaq's. "Thank you," he said, his voice low and sincere. "For everything." Shaq nodded, his expression serious for a moment. "You're welcome, Reggie. But this?" He gestured to the shop again. "This is just the beginning." Reggie's smile returned, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, it is." As Shaq turned to leave, Reggie called after him. "Hey, Shaq." Shaq paused, looking back. Reggie smirked. "Hi." Reggie smirked, his eyes twinkling. "You just got the best cut of your life, and it only cost you a whole building." The room erupted in laughter again, the sound echoing through the shop and spilling out into the street. Shaq shook his head, chuckling as he walked out the door, but as he stepped into the sunlight, his smile faded slightly. He glanced down the street, his eyes narrowing. Marcus was out there somewhere, and Shaq knew this wasn't over. Not yet. Shaq's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, his stomach dropping as he read the text. "We need to talk. Now." It was from Marcus. Shaq stared at the screen, his jaw tightening. The game wasn't over, and the next move could change everything.